Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to introduce some ideas that hopefully will be useful as we're going forth with a couple of the other topics that we'll cover very shortly. They're coming from this paper from Matthew Rabin, and my plan for going over this lecture is to kind of introduce us to how the economic theory can be used to show these things, but I don't want to go through all the details as you would if you're working through the paper. I'll show a lot of them. I'll talk a little bit about it, but before you know it, it gets quite a bit more technical than we'd be interested. Like it gets really quickly beyond like an intermediate micro sort of level, really quickly be like into like a master's or even like a second year PhD type thing to work through. And so we don't need to go through all those details. The important thing that I want to do is I want to show, firstly, what the ideas here are, especially because they're going to be useful for when we think about strategic ignorance. The other thing I want to do is I want to show how, okay, this is how you could model constraints on behavior. You could model morality using economic theory. Like the math will work, we can get there, and it's a little bit more complicated than we care to go through in great detail, but I think at least seeing it, I think there's value in doing that. And so that's typically how I'll go over this, and then real quickly I'll go to the next lecture, and that'll be on strategic ignorance. So you actually want to think of this video and then the strategic ignorance video as kind of complements. Actually, in the strategic ignorance video, I'm going to reference this lecture and actually only talk about it on like 2 slides, but these are the ideas that we're going to care about for this. So anyway, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to think about this model of moral behavior coming from Rabin. So this has been, at least as far as I know, still an unpublished paper. And what Rabin's asking us to do, I think it'll always be unpublished, but what Rabin's asking us to do is think of morality as a constraint rather than as built into preferences. And this should be relatively natural. Coming from economics, we think of constraints. We think of constrained optimization. So it's a really natural model to develop. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to think about introducing this theoretical model as sort of a foundation for, well, the experiments that'll follow. So in particular, to give us like the context for the DWK and Vanderweel paper that we'll think about. And ultimately, this will be 2 kind of experimental designs that are following from this logic. The second thing we want to do is we want to think about some of the prescriptions that Rabin will give. I'll kind of cover at the end of the slides in terms of like how we could handle a situation where people actually have this sort of strategic relationship with information. And so there's some interesting suggestions from Rabin, as well as you can think of other solutions yourself. All right, so here's the paper, and it's sort of an unpublished paper. But I mean, so it was one of the probably the second paper from Rabin that I had read when I was in grad school, and I think it's a good paper. Anyway, so Rabin's observing that earlier work from economics has typically thought about putting morality into the utility function. We think of people might have a preference for altruism, or people might have a preference for good behavior. Like we thought about the altruism lecture where I talked about maybe we could model following Andreoni. We could think of altruism or charity as a good that people purchase, and for the purpose of consuming this warm glow, the satisfaction of having done something good, and so this could enter into a person's utility. All right, so Rabin then thinks about, well, we've got other literature thinking of moral dispositions as a constraint on behavior. And so in this paper, what's going on is we have a simple model thinking about the different implications of what if we have people where morality is a preference, what if we have people where morality is a constraint. And so we want to think about this. To my mind, at least, the morality as a constraint formulation seems really appealing. I mean, especially coming from economics. The basic idea, though, thinking about these 2 modeling conventions is like, depending on how a person's motivated, whether that's their natural constituency or if it's how they're motivated for one particular set of issues or another, or set of behaviors, this will have very different implications in terms of their relationship with information and then the behavior we see. So for instance, a person with a preference for moral behavior ought to probably seek out all possible information to assist their pursuit of acting in the right way. we expect that, like, if you're motivated by a preference to do what's right, you want to gather all the information necessary to help you do exactly what's right. By contrast, a person viewing morality as a constraint on behavior would maybe be really selective and focus on information only in a self-serving manner, right? If I've got this constraint on my behavior, maybe I don't want to go and find the information that'll make this constraint binding, and that's an important issue. All right, so Rabin's model is going to involve this agent maximizing utility subject to a morality constraint, and then, as I suggested, binding depending on the level of information received. So here's the quote from the paper. When their beliefs tell them that it's morally okay to engage in enjoyable activity, the agent will avoid gathering further information that might jeopardize their moral green light. You can think of interesting reasons, of course, why that would be the case in situations. All right, so here's like the theory aspect of the paper. So you think of like the applications of theory is really interesting. I'll get us kind of to the doorstep of being able to work through the paper. I don't want to go through all the details. I want to get just enough so I can motivate the fact that this is a theory paper and it's using mathematics and economic theory in an elegant way to be able to describe these aspects of morality. All right, so we have our agent choosing x, which is in the interval or in the set from 0 to 1. So binary, so either 0 or 1. So x indicates that they're engaging the behavior. As x is 1, x is 0 indicates that they're abstaining from the behavior. Then we have the agent's enjoyment level, which is measured by v of x. So it's going to be 0 if they abstain, and then it could be maximal at 1. And then some little v in this open interval is going to be just the parameter measuring how enjoyable they find that activity. So it could be anywhere between 0, which is 0, they just haven't consumed anything, up to 1. Okay, so for instance, the person can eat grapes or not eat grapes, and maybe they find eating grapes to be enjoyable, right? And then we could rank their level of enjoyment from that particular activity. That said, suppose they would, other things equal, prefer to avoid eating grapes if they believe doing so hurts others. Maybe the production process bringing these grapes to market exploits workers or causes environmental damage, whatever is the case. Maybe you think there's social harm. And so you don't want to be responsible. You don't want to participate in this activity, in this market that's going to introduce social harm. And so there's going to be this element of distaste, right? So denote by W of X the social harm due to X and assume that it's either harmful or it's not. So the activity is either harmful or not. Well, abstaining never causes harm, so that's just going to be 0. And then the individual believes their activity causes harm with some probability Q. And this is going to allow us to generate the standard sort of expected utility model. So they choose either 0, they abstain, or 1, they do the action with the goal of maximizing. Remember, V of X is like the value or the enjoyment they get from eating grapes in this case. Q is the probability with which they cause harm, and then W of X is that harm. All right, so they have moral preferences if they try to maximize their utility function, which is a function of their enjoyment and then the likelihood of harm. So they choose such that they get V minus Q if they do the behavior, they get 0 if they don't. And then we would say our moral agent will engage in the activity if and only if Q is less than or equal to V, right? Probability of social harm is not greater than their own private benefit. All right, so that's sort of the standard development. Now Rabin will say they're following a moral rule if they maximize this function. So now we've got V minus G of Q, all right? And otherwise, it's like if they do it or if they don't. Okay, so what's this G? Okay, so G of Q is equal to 1 when Q is bigger than this Y and where G is less than or equal to Y. In other words, they do not engage in the activity when the probability that it causes social harm is too high. Otherwise, they get full pleasure, right? And so if they've got some level, they've got some probability with which some threshold level, some probability with which that social harm is too high, then they'll just not do that activity. And if the likelihood is less, then they'll do the activity. I think I probably meant to have a Q here. Yeah, I think I did. So I want Q is greater than 0. Think of like the probability with which it causes harm is like 50-50, like a half. So then we'd also want that probability. We want this to be Q. All right. So anyway, they are guided by a moral rule or constraint on their utility maximizing goals. So then the next thing that Rabin does, and this is interesting. So it defines this property of fixed belief behaviorally equivalent. And then, so there's some propositions, theorems, and interesting things in terms of the economic theory in this paper. Basic idea is that we've got these two different utility functions, and then Rabin shows that under certain conditions, the utility functions can be fixed belief behaviorally equivalent, and if we know the individual's beliefs but not the specific preferences, we'd still get the same behavior. In other words, if we know what the individuals are believe, we don't know their preference structure, we could still observe the exact same behavior from those agents. All right, so our rule agent will behave like a preference agent for all possible beliefs, if and only if their moral rule is don't do anything that isn't defensible from the perspective of social welfare. In other words, we can come up with ways where they're going to behave exactly the same. So our P agent is FBBE to an R agent exactly when, well, V is their private value, and then Y was the threshold with which the harm is created. Okay, so now we've shown how we can get these two agents to do the same behavior, or we can model a situation where the two agents are doing the same behavior. Now what we're interested in doing is we're interested in thinking about how these individuals will manage their information collection. So the next couple slides, this is the part that I want to kind of skip over. I'd kind of sort of gloss over. So that we've got this probability distribution from which beliefs are generated and captured. So, right, we've got this function, has the function of determining the agent's cost of belief manipulation, where C of F, non-zero or non-negative, is the cost of generating whatever is this information distribution. And so, anyway, so you can go look at the paper and so on and so forth. But the basic idea, got some interesting theory. You can I'll show this just long enough so we're able to kind of see what's going on. And I think this is a decent sketch, but it's a little bit, this aspect is always a little bit more technical than I want to get to. And so the last thing I want to do is say, all right, so we introduced the idea or Rabin introduces the idea that we've got these utility functions, or we've got these preference structures. We can model our agent, the one who's got a preference for moral behavior, and we've got the one who's got this moral constraint on their behavior. Under certain conditions, they'll behave the same. And then there's this information generation function where they can learn something about what's ultimately going to be that belief, what's going to be that probability of harm, Q. And so now we've got the different ways in which, well, it can be costly to obtain information. Assuming it's too costly to obtain information, for instance, at the stage of belief manipulation, the P agent considers a social harm caused by choosing a signal. Our agent won't, right? And so in other words, like some agents, our preference agent will want to seek out information and then engage in right behavior, and our constraint agent doesn't want to. So Rabin comes up with or suggests three sort of information interventions to help overcome this problem. The first one is called a salience injection. So the idea with a salience injection is, well, let's try to make the information not only available, but also completely unavoidable. So you can think about using the packaging of products. In the United States, for a while, I think we were thinking of placing really graphic images on cigarettes, right? So of like people with terrible diseases caused by smoking. And you could think of like the idea of making the information not only available, like you can search really quickly and find all the health risks. You can do a DNA test and you can find probably your specific risks for a lot of diseases. But when you make the information not only available in the sense of like it's there if you find it, but also unavoidable, like you can't avoid seeing this if you're going to consume this product. You could think of this a number of different ways. This is the salience injection. So the idea is we're going to force the agent, in some sense, to encounter the information before making their decision. So the idea is, well, if people are guided by moral preferences, as long as the information is available to them, you wouldn't need to bother forcing them to consider it, because if they got a preference for moral behavior, they're just going to go and find the behavior, right? And if people are completely amoral, if they don't care about morality, there's no point in providing the information anyway. Or suppose we're no longer talking about morality, maybe it's health or whatever is the case. If people simply have no preference one way or the other, it's just not affecting their behavior, there's like think of like price elasticity of demand to be like zero, right? Or cross price elasticity of demand to be like zero. So positive is substitutes, negative is complements, zero is unrelated goods, independent goods. That's like this would be the person who's completely indifferent to the information. There's no point. However, if people are bound by moral constraints, then imposing the truth on them can be productive even if their behavior is not forced in any way, and even if the information was already available but previously ignored, now impossible to ignore. So I think that's interesting. And then the basic idea is you've got this idea of sending a signal to the agent that then causes them to update their beliefs. And so you can think of the idea of when our constraints agent tries to stay ignorant, basically if it's costly to obtain the information, either in the sense of actually the information acquisition is costly or it'll change their behavior. And then salience injection basically tries to make it as likely as possible that they're going to encounter the information. All right, so the next one is moral dogmatism. So the basic idea here is let's indoctrinate people with socially imposed moral dictums to reduce free thought of moral consequences of their actions. I mean, that's interesting. So let's think about why this would work, though. Actually, if moral dogmatism is successful, it might even prevent information acquisition, because now people have imposed moral dictums that are going to kind of guide their behavior and reduce free thought. So initially, we might think, okay, so why do we want to? What happens if we reduce free thought? Typically, we want people to be open-minded. Well, interestingly, like if you follow through the logic of the paper, Proposition 4 implies moral conduct is undermined when people are too open-minded. So why would that be? Well, you could tell yourself a lot of different stories. So think about the ways that people could rationalize or could seek out self-serving information and so on and so forth. And so you could think of situations where being too open-minded could undermine moral conduct, because you could end up with sort of like an anything goes sort of outcome. Last thing is moral priming. So the idea is, well, what if we are able to coach people up before they encounter the situation? So the idea is potentially society has an interest in encouraging people to think through appropriate moral criteria before they know whether and how they have to apply those criteria. And then when they encounter in the future, they're sort of unconsciously primed to behave in a particular way, right? Then if the situation does arise, a person who has reached certain moral judgments may not reverse their opinion to fit self-interest. So is this realistic? Is it plausible? Do we think this will work? I don't know. So I was part of the generation, I know maybe those in my class now, I'm not sure, who had the DARE program, Drug Abuse Resistance Education, when I was in 5th grade. So I got the nice DARE t-shirt, and it's interesting because everyone in the school went through this program. You got this cool t-shirt, and you got to play football at recess with literally the whole class, with the officer who was teaching, who was one of our friends' dads, and it was a cool time. Anecdotally, I'm not sure that the moral priming of the DARE program had quite the intended effect. Who knows? I suppose you don't necessarily observe the counterfactual, but where I'll stop talking now is like, I don't know that this works. So it's interesting nevertheless. All right. So in terms of thinking about these three interventions, well, we have this idea for salience injection, which is we can get around problems with people avoiding information by making the information unavoidable, and then they have to consider it before making the decision. Moral dogmatism can guide people kind of in a mindset and maybe kind of avoid them from finding information that can give themselves a way out of what would be the right course of action. And then moral priming could potentially have people make up their minds about a situation before they encounter it, and therefore they follow the right follow the right course of action nevertheless. Anyway, so it's like I said, it's an interesting paper. I skipped over a lot of the theory here, and some interesting things to see. I have a set of notes where I work through a little bit more carefully. I didn't want to go through this all right here. because it goes beyond kind of what we care about for the standpoint of the class. But anyway, so go ahead and conclude here. Hope you enjoyed the video, and then I'll see you for next time.